Okay, we're gonna be learning some science today. How would a nuclear EMP affect the power grid? That's what we're gonna be looking at right now. We gotta learn. It's science class right now. Get your
Late in the
popcorn.
morning
Actually,
of
you
April
get no
28,
popcorn.
1958,
No
the
popcorn for
USS
you.
Boxer aircraft carrier ship was about 70 miles off the coast of the Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean. The crew of the Boxer was preparing to launch a high-altitude helium balloon. In fact, this would be the 17th high-altitude balloon to be launched from the ship. But this one was a little different. Where those first 16 balloons carried some instruments and dummy payloads, attached to this balloon was a 1.7 kiloton nuclear warhead,
Oh, really?
codenamed Yucca. The ship, balloon, and bomb were all part of Operation Hardtack, a series of nuclear tests conducted by the United States in 1958. Yucca was the first test of a nuclear blast in the upper limits of Earth's atmosphere. About an hour and a half after the balloon was launched, it reached an altitude of 85,000 feet, or 26,000 meters. As two B-36 Peacemaker bombers loaded down with instruments circled the area, the warhead was detonated. Of course, the research team collected all kinds of data during the blast, including the speed of the shockwave, the effect on air pressure, and the magnitude of nuclear radiation released. But from two locations on the ground, they were also measuring the electromagnetic waves resulting from the blast. It had been known since the first nuclear explosions that blasts generate an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, mainly because it kept frying electronic instruments. But until hardtack, nobody had ever measured the waves generated from a detonation in the upper atmosphere. What they recorded was so far beyond their expectations that it was dismissed as an anomaly for years. All that appears in the report is a casual mention of the estimated electromagnetic field strength at one of the monitoring stations being around 5 times the maximum limit of the instruments. It wasn't until 5 years later that the US physicist Conrad Longmire would propose a theory for electromagnetic pulses from high-altitude nuclear blasts that is still the widely accepted explanation for why they're orders of magnitude stronger than those generated from blasts on the ground. Since then, our fears of nuclear war not only included the scenario of a warhead hitting a populated area, destroying cities and creating nuclear fallout, but also the possibility of one detonating far above our heads in the upper atmosphere, sending a strong enough EMP to disrupt electronic devices and even take out the power grid. As with most weapons, the best and most comprehensive research on EMPs is classified, but in 2019, a coalition of energy organizations and government entities called the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, funded a study to try and understand exactly what could happen to the power grid from a high-altitude nuclear EMP.
What's going to
It's
happen?
not the only study of
You
its
gonna blow
kind,
it?
and it's not without criticism from those who think it leans optimistic, but it has the most juicy engineering details from all the research I could find, and the answers are quite a bit different than Hollywood would have you believe. This is a summary of that report, and it's the first in a deep dive series of videos about large-scale threats to the grid. I'm Grady, and this is Practical Engineering. In today's episode, we're talking about the impact of a nuclear EMP on our power infrastructure.
That shit looks crazy, bro. That shit looks insane, actually. Like you're a small human. Imagine that shit. I don't care if you're 6 feet. You're not bigger
This
than
video
that
is
shit.
sponsored by
It's just,
Curiosity
bro.
Stream and Nebula. More on them later.
Stop.
That shit's
If
actually
we're doing
insane.
holiday shopping this year, you really have to
Bro,
stop.
I don't know who you are, but I need you to get off my screen, my channel, what I'm watching right now. I'm gonna need you to get ghost.
A nuclear detonation is unwelcome in nearly every circumstance. These events are inherently dangerous, and the physics of a blast go way beyond our intuitions. That's especially true in the upper atmosphere, where the detonation interacts with Earth's magnetic field and its atmosphere in some very unique ways to create an
Mushroom
electromagnetic
cloud.
pulse. An EMP actually has 3 distinct components, all formed by different physical mechanisms that can have significantly different impacts here on Earth's surface. The first part of an EMP is called E1. This is the extremely fast and intense pulse that immediately follows detonation. The gamma rays released during any nuclear detonation collide with
those
electrons,
boats down there.
ionizing atoms, and creating a burst of
That shit is
electromagnetic
crazy, bro.
radiation
I would
that's
be so
generally
fucking
bad on
scared,
its own,
nigga.
but when detonated high in the atmosphere, Earth's magnetic field
Look at
interacts
that,
with those
bro.
free electrons to produce a significantly stronger electromagnetic pulse
Hey,
than
phone.
if
Shut
detonated
up.
within the denser air at lower altitudes.
We're learning right
The
now.
E1 pulse comes and goes within a few nanoseconds, and the energy is somewhat jokingly referred to as DC to daylight. daylight, meaning it's spread across a huge part of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Mm.
The E1 pulse generally reaches anywhere within a line of sight of the detonation, and for a high-altitude burst, this can cover an enormous area of land. At the height of the Yucca test, that's a circle with an area larger than Texas. A weapon at 200 kilometers in altitude could impact a significant
no, it got
fraction of North
Arizona.
America. But not everywhere within that circle experiences the strongest fields.
I think I'll be safe.
The further from the blast you are,
I think I'm like towards down here. Phoenix is like right here, huh? Phoenix is like kind of towards the middle. So I'm you see, like Phoenix might be like right here, but I'm like Phoenix like right here, so I'm safe.
the lower the amplitude of the EMP. But because of Earth's magnetic field, the maximum amplitude occurs a little bit south of ground zero in the northern hemisphere, creating this pattern called a smile diagram. But no one will be smiling to find out that they're within the affected area of a high-altitude nuclear blast. Although a weapon like this wouldn't damage buildings, create nuclear fallout, be felt by humans, or probably even visible to most, that E1 pulse can have a huge effect on electronic devices. You're probably familiar with antennas.
If that shit fries my PlayStation or my computer, I'm fighting whoever did it. I'm fighting people. I don't even got insurance on these bitches. Actually, I got insurance on my PlayStation, not my computer.
Convert radio signals into voltage.
But we fighting people,
within a
bro.
Conductor. Well, for a strong enough pulse spread across a huge range of frequencies, essentially any metallic object will act like an antenna, converting the pulse into massive voltage spikes that can overwhelm digital devices. And the E1 pulse happens so quickly that even devices meant to protect against surges may not be effective. Of course, with just about everything having embedded electronics these days, this has far-reaching implications. But on the grid, there are really only a few places where an E1 pulse is a major concern. The first is with the control systems within power plants themselves. The second is communication systems used to monitor and record data to assist grid operators. The EPRI report focused primarily on the third hazard associated with an E1 pulse, digital protective relays. Most folks have seen the breakers that protect circuits in your house.
Yeah.
The electrical grid has similar equipment used to protect transmission lines and transformers in the event of a short circuit or fault. But unlike the breakers in your house that do both the sensing for trouble and the circuit breaking all in one device, those roles are separate on the grid. The physical
makes sense.
disconnecting of a circuit under load is done by large motor-controlled contactors quenched in oil or dielectric gas to prevent the formation of arcs. And the devices that monitor voltage and current for problems and tell the breakers when to fire are called relays. They're normally located in a small building in a substation to protect them from weather. That's because most relays these days are digital equipment, full of circuit boards, screens, and microelectronics. And all those components are particularly susceptible to electromagnetic interference. In fact, most countries have strict regulations about the strength and frequency of electromagnetic radiation you can foist upon the airwaves, rules that I hope I'm not breaking with this device. This is a pulse generator I bought off eBay just to demonstrate
think
the
it would be
weird
good.
effects that electromagnetic radiation can have on electronics.
What that
This
shit
outputs
got
a
my
50
computer
megahertz
through the
wave through this
video?
antenna, and you can see when I turn it on near this cheap multimeter, it has some
I know it's
strange
not possible.
effects.
I'm just saying what
Reading
if
on
it
the
did.
display gets
That'd be
erratic,
crazy.
and sometimes I can get the backlight to turn on. You can also see the two different types of E1 vulnerabilities here. An EMP can couple to the wires that serve as inputs to the device, and an EMP can radiate the equipment directly. In both cases, this little device wasn't strong enough to cause permanent damage to the electronics, but hopefully it helps you imagine what's possible when high-strength fields are applied to sensitive electronic devices. The EPRI report actually subjected digital relays to strong EMPs to see what the effects would be.
And what
They
happened?
used a Marx generator, which is a voltage multiplying circuit, so I decided to try it myself. The Marx generator stores electricity in these capacitors as they charge in parallel. When triggered, the spark gaps connect all the capacitors in series to generate very high voltages, upwards of 80 or 90 kilovolts in my case. My fellow YouTube engineer, Electroboom, has built one of these on his channel if you want to
That's
learn
cool.
more about them.
Is he the dude that touches shit?
Mine generates a high voltage spark when triggered by the screw.
Because I know. Hold on.
Stop.
We're gonna go back because I want to see the
Shopping this year,
spark.
you really have to
But
stop. I'm gonna show you
get off
one
my
simple
screen
trick.
first of all. And also, there was this dude who did like science experiments, but he would touch the science experiment like something would be like like on like electric, right? It would be like electrifying or whatever, And like he would put his hand into it and like zap himself and like fucking yell.
Mine
I
generates a
don't know
high
his name.
voltage spark when
I
triggered by
forgot
the
it.
screwdriver. Don't try
Damn,
this at home, by the way. I
that
didn't
shit looks
design an
cool.
antenna to convert this high voltage pulse into an EMP, but I
So
did try a direct
if
injection
you use as
device.
an EMP,
This
will it
cheap
make you go
kitchen
wacky?
frame
Like
didn't stand a chance.
there would just be a bunch of sparks all over? Damn.
Just to clarify, this is in no way a scientific test. It's just a fun demonstration to give you an idea of what an E1 pulse might be capable of.
Did it turn it back on?
The E2 pulse is slower than E1 because it's generated in a totally different way, this time from the interaction of gamma rays and neutrons. It turns out that an E2 pulse is roughly comparable to a lightning strike. In fact, many lightning strikes are more powerful than those that could be generated by high-altitude nuclear detonations. Of course, the grid's not entirely immune to lightning, but we do use lots of lightning protection technology. Most equipment on the grid is already hardened against some high-voltage pulses, such that lightning strikes don't usually create much damage.
That's
So the
cap
E2
because my whole system was off for like a day. And that shit on TikTok, for real,
isn't as
that
threatening
shit was
to our
out for
power
like 8
infrastructure,
hours.
especially
I
compared
don't
to
even know
a
how long it was
non-E2.
actually.
The final component of an
It was funny
EMP,
because
called
as soon as I
E3,
ended
is
stream, I was
again
like, yeah,
much
they should
different
turn
than
it
the
off.
other two. It's really not even a pulse at all because it's generated in an entirely different way. When a nuclear detonation happens in the upper atmosphere, Earth's magnetic field is disturbed and distorted. As the blast dissipates, the magnetic field slowly returns to its original state over the course of a few minutes. This is similar to what happens when a geomagnetic storm on the sun disrupts Earth's gravity, and large solar events could potentially be a bigger threat than a nuclear EMP to the grid. In both cases, it's because of the disturbance and movement of Earth's magnetic field. You probably know what happens when you move a magnetic field through a conductor. You generate a current. We call that coupling, and it's essentially how antennas work. And in
Really?
fact, antennas work best when their size matches the size of the electromagnetic waves. For example, AM radio uses frequencies down to 540 kilohertz. That corresponds to wavelengths that can be upwards of 1,800 feet or 550 meters. Big waves. Rather than serving as a place to mount antennas like FM radio or cell towers, AM radio towers are the antenna. The entire metal structure is energized. You can often tell an AM tower by looking at the bottom because they sit atop a small ceramic insulator that electrically separates them from the ground. As you can imagine, the longer the wavelength, the larger an antenna has to be to couple well with the electromagnetic radiation. And hopefully you see what I'm getting at. Electrical transmission and distribution lines often run for miles, making them the ideal place for an E3 pulse to couple and generate current. Here's why that's a problem. All along the grid, we use transformers to change the voltage of electricity. On the transmission side, we increase the voltage to reduce losses in the lines, and on the distribution side, we lower the voltage back down to make it safer for customers to use in their houses and buildings. Those transformers work using electromagnetic fields. One coil of wire generates a magnetic field that passes through a core to induce current to flow through an adjacent coil. In fact, the main reason we use alternating current on the grid is because it allows us to use these really simple devices to step voltage up or down. But transformers have a limitation, and I have a demonstration set up to show what it is. This is a doorbell transformer connected to a rheostat, which is just a variable resistor, and also connected to my oscilloscope so we can see the output waveform of the transformer. Turning the knob on the rheostat changes the resistance between the outputs of the transformer, simulating a changing power demand. You can see that for most of the range of the rheostat, the voltage coming out of the transformer stays the same, around 18 volts peak to peak. But there is a point on the rheostat where the voltage out of the transformer starts to drop off because it's not able to meet the demand. This isn't because the wires are too hot or too thin, it's because the core is saturated. This may be clearer on a graph. Up to a certain point, most materials used for transformer cores have a linear relationship between how much current flows and the strength of the resulting magnetic field. But this relationship breaks down at the saturation point, beyond which additional current won't create much further magnetism to drive current on the secondary winding. An E3 pulse can induce a roughly DC flow of current through the transmission lines. So you have DC on top of AC, which creates a bias in the sine wave. If there's too much DC current, the transformer core might saturate when current moves in one direction but not the other, distorting the output waveform. That can lead to hot spots in the transformer core, damage to devices connected to the grid that expect a nice sinusoidal voltage pattern, and lots of other funky stuff.
Stop. Before you do any holiday shopping,
My guy.
you really have to see this.
My
Let me
guy.
show you one simple trick.
No, don't show me nothing.
So what are the implications of all this? For the E1 pulse damaging some relays, that's probably not a big deal. There are often redundant paths for current to flow in the transmission system. That's why it's called the grid. But the more equipment that goes offline and the greater the stress on the remaining lines, the greater the likelihood of a cascading failure or total collapse. EPRI did tests simulating a 1 megaton bomb detonated at 200 kilometers in altitude. They estimated that about 5% of transmission lines could have a relay that gets damaged or disrupted by the resulting EMP. That alone probably isn't enough to cause a large-scale blackout of the power grid, but don't forget about E3. EPRI found that the third part of an EMP could lead to regional blackouts in
No, like the first one, E1 was at the top, right? And then E2 was like towards the middle, and then E3 was at the bottom. I always feel whenever it's at the top, it's always worse. But then he said E1 wouldn't be that bad. So I'm like, damn.
Encompassing multiple states because of transformer core saturation and imbalances between supply and demand of electricity. Their modeling didn't lead to widespread damage to the actual transformers, and that's a good thing because power transformers are large, expensive devices that are hard to replace, and most utilities don't keep many spares sitting around. All that being said, their report isn't without criticism, and many believe that an EMP could result in far more damage to electric power infrastructure. When you combine the effects of the E1 pulse and the E3
No, lightning
pulse,
is so
it's
dope.
not hard to imagine how the grid
But
could be
crazy
seriously
scary.
disabled. It's also easy to see how even if the real damages to equipment aren't that significant, the widespread nature of an EMP, plus its potential impacts on other systems like computers and telecommunications, has the potential to frustrate the process of getting things back online. A multi-day, multi-week, or even multi-month blackout isn't out of the question in the worst-case scenario. It's probably not going to cause a Hollywood-style return to the Stone Age for humanity, but it is certainly capable of causing a major disruption to our daily lives. We'll explore what that means in a future video. But if you have trouble waiting for the next practical engineering video, you should know that they go live on Nebula before hitting YouTube, and you can watch them without any ads. If you haven't heard about Nebula by now, it's a streaming service built by creators that uses a different model than YouTube. Instead of being supported by ads, you just pay a small subscription fee. That sounds like a small difference, but the result is a huge distinction.
Now I feel like you should watch my ads, but I'm dead. Grady. AMP radio antennas are usually located nearer to the ground than FM antennas. The broadcast signal from an AM antenna can result in the structures such as cranes becoming charged, resulting in high voltage. Yeah, I don't want to read all that, but this was very informative. So, yeah, subscribe to Practical Engineering, subscribe to me. By me first, like both our shits, and bye.